As far as tyrants go, Mad Max franchise's Immortan Joe is easily one of the most intense villains in cinematic history. His character arc is so interesting that after Fury Road hit the screens in 2015, a new prequel tie-in comics was released to double down on the process of how a normal human being rose to the position of being a godlike tyrant. But you know what really stands out? The guy's impeccable design. I mean, the length that George Miller went in order to make his mortal villain look like a ruler straight out of hell is truly impeccable. Sadly, none of the movies or the prequels quite cover the physiological feats of Immortan Joe's character, and well, let's just say this is where we come in. In this video, we'll discuss every single anatomical design of Immortan Joe. So without wasting a single moment, let's get right into it. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin. Who is Immortan Joe? If you're well versed with the base of the Mad Max saga, you know it is set in a dystopian dry land where basic human necessities like water and food are the most important currencies. And you know who is the king of this world? The one sitting on heaps of these resources while the common crowd suffers before his post-apocalyptic rise to power and before he became Immortan Joe. This guy was a rogue military officer named Colonel Joe Morton. The only thing he did differently than others was he seized the gaping hole of power that rose with a worldwide conflagration and the collapse of infrastructure to elevate himself into a godlike supremacy. The villain's backstory gives us a glimpse of just how easily the line between civilization and barbarism can blur out. Joe's eventual establishment of order in the chaotic wasteland isn't driven by noble intentions, but by his own selfish desire for power and control. Colonel Joe Morton was a key figure in the tumultuous times before the apocalypse, known for his roles in the oil wars and as a hero in the water wars. Initially called the Colonel by his followers, he had access to all the critical resources, weaponry, and manpower. These assets gave him a significant edge in a harsh, lawless environment that Australia became in the Mad Max universe. So by using his ruthless and strategic mind, the Colonel leveraged these advantages to transform himself into a despot, ruling the wasteland with an iron fist. At the beginning, he formed a biker gang that terrorized the survivors after the fall of civilization. His gang included ruthless henchmen like Major Kalashnikov and a cunning strategist named Deep Dog. With every battle, the gang grew stronger by killing the leaders of other groups and capturing their women. Eventually, his vision of restoring society quickly took a darker turn. As time went by, he and his gang ventured into the wasteland where they discovered a massive aquifer plant which would later come to be known as the Citadel. It was not very long before Joe and his biker gang took over Bullet Farm, Gastown, and eventually the Citadel. In this sense, the Colonel seized an opportunity that most people wouldn't even notice, let alone take advantage of. Joe Morton's military experience and his clear lack of concern for human life, something that existed even before the collapse of society, actually enabled him to create a new social order centered entirely around his own power. As a result, the Colonel became more than just a leader. He became a figure of immortality in the eyes of his followers.
You will ride eternal, shining and
How did Colonel Joe ascend to godhood? Amidst all the dying world, any remaining hint of humanity in Colonel Joe Morton vanished quickly as he became a ruthless and calculating monster, returning humanity to its most primitive state. Morton's orders were to kill any men they encountered and assimilate the women and children into their ranks. This path eventually led him to the Citadel, his stronghold in Fury Road, where he attained a godlike status among his followers. The brutal reality of that world made it immensely difficult for the survivors to distinguish fact from legend. People began to worship Joe like a god as he transformed the aquifer into the three towers of the Citadel and further searched the wasteland for more resources. He took over the oil refinery in the north and used it to produce fuel for his growing army. He called this place the Gas Town and allowed the People Eater to run it. After Joe took charge of an old lead mine, he turned it into the Bullet Farm by converting it into a factory for weapons, ammunition, and explosives to support the Citadel's battles against other gangs gangs in the Wasteland. He put his former gang member, Major Kalashnikov, now called the Bullet Farmer, in charge of running it. Interestingly, the prequel comic shows that Immortan Joe was a student of history before the fall, so he likely took inspiration from some of the most brutal leaders of the past to shape his conquest of the Wasteland. I think he breached the Citadel's defenses using a historical tactic which marked his pivotal moment of transformation from the Colonel into Immortan Joe. Reigning victorious from what seemed like a certain form of death, his followers gave him his new name, but as Fury Road made it very clear that for Joe, immortality became more than just a title, it became an obsession.
Is she taking them?
She didn't take them, they begged her to go!
What was Joe Immortan like? In his prime, Joe was a large and imposing man, known for his signature gas mask and long, slick-back dark brown hair that was tied with a bandana across his forehead. He usually wore a rather rough leather sleeveless jacket decorated with military-style epaulets on the left shoulder, while his right shoulder were protected by a studded metal armor. But underneath his quasi-military jacket, Joe wore a simple black muscle shirt. As far as I think, those of the eccentric additions to his jacket were actually products of everything he scavenged through his conquests. There is one thing to note: Joe was resourceful, ruthless, and determined, but above all, he was idealistic. He had a true vision for the future that was not content with just surviving by raiding the Wasteland. Instead, he sought to create a legacy that would outlive him, and it was this idealistic vision that led him to his destiny with the Aquifer. It was through sheer determination and hard work that Joe managed to gather a strong and ruthless group around him, but among his men, only he understood the importance of the Citadel's water supply, the nearby oil refinery, and the lead farm. So over time, Joe transformed his band of raiders into a small empire who had a mechanized army of dedicated warriors, access to fresh water, irrigated crops, oil refineries, and a factory for weapons and ammunition. Even though Joe's domain stood in the middle of a desolate wasteland, he barbarically ruled his own island of civilization with an iron fist. Given he is a history student, Joe embodies many characteristics commonly seen in cult leaders and dictators. He is a powerful orator and uses his skill to captivate his audience with grand speeches to acquire their loyalty. Joe is also a pompous ass who constantly reminds everyone of his control over the Citadel's resources, reinforcing his authority over the people whenever he sees fit. And it certainly helps his case when other warlords like Dementus and his biker horde threaten his rule, because Joe has a devoted group of 1,000 warboys at his disposal who idolize him and obey his commands without raising a single question. Immortan Joe had doctrined them into his army and brainwashed them since infancy, to a point that they were even willing to sacrifice themselves for his desires. In return, Joe promised them a place of honor in Valhalla, which allowed them to die under the fake glory of fostering a sense of eternal camaraderie with him after death. Despite his totalitarian rule, Joe somehow had an altruistic nature, as he believes he is benefiting the society within the Citadel and doing right by them by correctly rationing the water supplies, growing and distributing crops, using enslaved human beings as living blood bags for his warboys, and implementing a breeding program to ensure a successor that would carry on the legacy of his vision. Even though he deeply cares for his wives, Immortan Joe treats them more like his own property, as he often calls them his treasures. In the Mad Max Fury Road comic, Joe believes that his wives are unappreciative of what he considers generosity. Apparently, living as imprisoned sex slaves is the best life they can have in the desolate world after the fall, but according to him, these girls do not appreciate this freedom and have grown to become spoiled brats who dare to rebel against his authority. Even then, he cares about the women who carry his children and makes sure not to do anything that would put their lives at risk. This was also Joe's Achilles heel, something that Furiosa and his fives used as a weapon to exploit during their daring escape from the Citadel. Immortan Joe's twisted sexual kinks. The prequel comics vividly explores Immortan Joe's sexual kinks, something that will inherently gross you out, as he refers to himself as daddy in the presence of his wives, and even asks his youngest wife to sit on his lap like a child right before he decides to take her virginity. He seems to enjoy the crazy age gap between him and his wives. In the comics, Toast, one of his 5 wives, even mentioned that once he forced her for anal penetration one night, which basically implies that his wives were not just there to carry marry his children, but also existed to pleasure him as he saw fit. Somehow, the comics also hints that he might have had a closeted thing for men, as the wives often mock him by saying he would rather sleep with a war boy than them. Even the history man narrating the comic story implied something along the same lines. And I think we can further support this claim by the fact that Joe often encourages the war boys by referring to himself as their daddy, which is a dynamic he only shares with his 5 wives. Was Immortan Joe sick? In his prime, Immortan Joe embodied the archetype of a Wasteland warlord, capable of taking on multiple dozens of enemies at once. But in his latter years, Joe aged into a stocky older man with long white hair and intense blue eyes. As his health began taking a dive, Joe started having respiratory issues and skin diseases, which covered his back with large pus-filled boils. But he was the king of the Citadel, and well, the king always receives the best. So, Joe had access to clean air through a respirator mask adorned with horse teeth connected to a large breathing apparatus hidden behind his head. To manage his pain, Joe covered himself in white powder, giving him a ghostly appearance, which was also something imitated by the war boys. Even then, Joe's health was not in a perfect state. Despite trying to maintain his godlike status among his subjects by becoming the only person to control the aquifer in the region, Joe sometimes needed his son to help him move, which is a definite example of how sick he really was. While I think most of his breathing issues might have been caused by radiation exposure, his tumor-like boils may have been a byproduct of cancer. Why did Immortan Joe wear his distinguished mask? When we saw Immortan Joe for the first time, before anything else, we noticed his mask. The mask Joe wears isn't just for show, it is a vital breathing apparatus. Without it, he practically could not survive in a harsh wasteland and would probably suffocate. While it may look like a surface-level accessory, it is apparently a part of his body, as the tubes go inside his throat to help him breathe. Throughout the years as he rose to become the primary warlord of the Wasteland, Joe became an old man whose health was affected by the unforgiving environment full of radiation and dust, ultimately becoming the cause of his failing health. The mask was actually the external assistance he needed to survive, and thus had to wear all the time, given it acted as an artificial respirator that helped him breathe clean air generated from the machine he carried on his back. But of course, he had to look menacing to the ones he ruled upon, which is why he decorated his mask with horse teeth, which basically gave it the skeleton look that Joe needed to oversell his frailty as a sign of immortality to his crippled subjects. So he was killing 2 birds with 1 stone, as the mask visually established Joe's dominance as the top leader while also serving as a crucial breathing aid. But again, this would not have been possible without Hugh Keys-Byrne's impeccable acting skills. He flawlessly brought out Immortan Joe's authority and intimidation to life. But there is one thing to take note, that the grinning skull image has been overused for centuries to intimidate people and establish a form of tyranny that is often associated with death. Although much of the backstory behind Immortan Joe wearing his mask was left unanswered, we know that it was something he wore long before he even came to rule the Wasteland. But the idea of his mask portrayed some form of a skeleton, which is often associated with the idea of death, and well, at the beginning his character did give off a similar vibe. Most people believe that the horse teeth were actually an augmented part of his face, but they are just a set of horse teeth attached to a mask itself, in order to invoke fear and symbolize his authority. I'm pretty sure that Furiosa only intended to rip off his mask with a harpoon, but personally, in Fury Road, before Furiosa kills Immortan Joe, I always imagined that the harpoon went through the mask into Joe's mouth, catching on the inside of his jaw. So, when it was torn out, it might have also torn or dislocated part of his jaw in the process, thus violently ripping it out along with half of his face. Why does Immortan Joe wear a chest plate? I'm pretty sure the initial idea of Immortan Joe wearing a chest plate with abs and six-packs was to exude a fake sense of perfection in an otherwise ailing tyrant villain. From a technical point of view, Joe's armor was transparent and shaped to look like a rather muscular anatomy, resembling a molded bulletproof riot shield. It included a breastplate, backplate, pauldrons on the shoulder armor, 2-part rebrace on the upper arm armor, and 2-piece vambraces on the forearm armor. But Joe's chest chest plate was actually quite functional, as it acted as a bulletproof plexiglass armor decorated with service medals that he scavenged during all his conquests after the fall. While people seem to believe it was just decorative, this chest armor was actually designed to both support his body and intimidate others, while also concealing his ailments from outsiders like the wretched and war boys. Both these factions viewed Joe as a god, and really, which god has a body covered in pustules? So while it covered his boils from being exposed to the harshness of the Wasteland, it also helped him hide his true self from a world that had worshipped and feared him. To further enhance his chest plate to look like an armor, it was decorated with many minuscule details like broken phone parts, gold and silver eagles with shields and anchors, and many other things that looked rather like collectibles from people he killed or ravaged.
She thinks she can lose us in there!
Is Immortan Joe really immortal? If you have stuck around till this part of the video and have not watched any of the recent Mad Max movies, I think you can still figure out that Immortan Joe is a con man who just wanted his subjects to believe that he was indeed immortal. But at the end of Mad Max Fury Road, after his trusted Imperator Furiosa turned against him and escaped with the 5 wives, Immortan Joe launched a relentless chase across the Wasteland to reclaim his most valuable assets. This was actually depicted as the Road War by the History Man. Anyways, during the intense chase, Furiosa, despite being heavily injured, somehow managed to climb into Immortan Joe's vehicle, the Giga Horse. She then lodged the harpoon into Joe's mouth, and as the chain connected to the harpoon was caught by the wheels of the Giga Horse, it exerted a tremendous amount of force, ripping off Immortan Joe's jaw, throat, and nose, resulting in his instant death. Joe's body was then covered in a white sheet and delivered on the Giga Horse back to the Citadel by Max, Furiosa, and the remaining 4 wives. When Max removed the sheet and presented his dead body to the wretched and the winchmen guarding the elevator, they basically ravaged his body from the vehicle, immediately tearing it apart into pieces, thus shattering the illusion of his power in an instant. Even though he was human, what powers did Immortan Joe have at his disposal? Just because he was human, it does not mean Immortan Joe was not powerful. He had an impressive aura and an elaborate set of skills to go with it that helped him rise as the dominant warlord in the post-apocalyptic Wasteland. Joe's charisma was unmatched, allowing him to captivate and manipulate crowds as he presented himself as a messiah, rallying hundreds of devoted followers, particularly the indoctrinated war boys who were ready to do anything for him. Apart from being a violent military leader, he was also a proficient orator who could sway anyone to his cause, even if it was a hoax. Plus, without his strategic intellect, Joe would never manage to become Immortan Joe with his own private kingdom amidst the ruins of the world while securing an endless amount of essential resources for his dominion. He was also smart enough to figure out Furiosa's next plan of action by simply deciphering the first clues and immediately figuring her escape off-road as an attempt to elope with his wives. He was also the first one to see right through Max and Furiosa's intentions to seize control of the Citadel. Apart from that, Joe was an amazing driver, as he kept up with Furiosa's war rig the entire time he was behind the wheel of his Giga Horse, his monster truck that was made by sandwiching 2 1959 Cadillac Coupe de Ville to serve as his vehicular throne of combat. In addition to that, Joe was a top-notch shooter, given that he was able to fire his revolver with one hand while driving with another. Not just that, all his shots were precise enough to land direct hits with lethal accuracy. So, had Max not used the People Eater as a direct human shield, Immortan Joe would have easily shot him down. So that was every possible thing I could think of about the anatomy of the nightmare-fueled visual design of Immortan Joe. I think his entire terrifying appearance in Mad Max Fury Road and Furiosa is a direct result of his in-universe obsession with extending his life at any cost. Fury Road's core idea revolved around Joe's fervent aspiration to create a lasting dynasty, which ultimately revealed his true desire for establishing a dynastic power. Joe could have gone to any extent to achieve that because he was not someone who could ever be content with ruling temporarily. Joe craved eternal control over the Wasteland. If you think his portrayal hinted at a desperation for immortality or any form of existence beyond death, which only deepened the villainy of his evil reign, what do you guys think of this iconic villain? Would you like us to cover Immortan Joe's entire life in detail? Let us know in the comment box below. As always, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.